we're at 7 o'clock. My name is Eleanor Martel, and I am the head of Reference and Information Services at the Flint Memorial Library, and we are so excited to have everybody here. This program is provided by the Town of North Reading and the Tewksbury Public Library, so we're excited to collaborate with them. Our presenter, Emily Channell-Justice, is the director of the Temerty Contemporary Ukraine Program at the Ukrainian Research Institute, Harvard University. She received her PhD in 2016 in sociocultural anthropology from the Graduate Center, City University of New York. Her research is focused on self-organized political activism in the context of Euromaidan protests, the Euromaidan protest movement in Ukraine in 2013 and 14, specifically among leftist, feminist, and student activists in Kiev. Dr. Channell-Justice will be leaving for Poland in a few days. There, she will be working on research with refugees. In August and September of 2021, she began a research project in Ukraine about internally displaced people. Because she cannot continue that project at this time, she will be in Poland to see how best to reorient the project to be about refugees. And without further ado, I will pass it over to her.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. And thanks so much for the invitation to be here tonight. And thank you everybody who's joining us. It's a wonderful turnout, and I think just showing how important this topic is. So our program, I'll give a background lecture with a slideshow, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A. You can submit your questions in the Q&A function. Since we have so many people, I'll just be reading off your questions through there. So, and I'm happy to talk about the things that I discussed in the slideshow, but also happy to talk about my upcoming research trip if that's something that people are interested in learning more about. So the war began on February 24th, 2022. We are now in the 8th week of war. According to the official estimates from the United Nations, 2,104 civilians have been killed thus far, including 188 children. And we can guess that the true number is substantially higher. And the Ukrainian government has claimed several thousand civilian deaths. There are already 5 million refugees, most of whom crossed Ukraine's western border into European countries. The Ukrainian armed forces claim that over 21,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in these 8 weeks. This could be an exaggeration, but the United States has reported that Russia has lost about 25% of the combat power that it originally had in use in this invasion. And even the Russian government is actually admitting that its soldiers are dying in Ukraine, although it's recently decided that it's going to restrict access to information about soldiers' deaths, so they're not even going to be reporting on that anymore. So I wanted to show this photo at the beginning of this slideshow. This is two Mariupols. Mariupol on the left is as you can see, a safe haven, a place where kids could play in their yards, and Mariupol on the right is a city that's been about 90% destroyed since the siege of that city began in February. And I'll keep coming back to Mariupol. I think this is a place that you've seen referenced in the news pretty regularly. And it's the site of one of the biggest humanitarian crises possibly ever that the world has ever experienced. But I want to start this presentation by talking a little bit more about how we got to where we are today. What are the claims that Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, are making, and what has the Ukrainian response been since the invasion began in February? So Vladimir Putin claims that Ukraine is not a country, and historically speaking, we have to go back quite a few thousand years to understand where those claims come from. Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire. It became officially part of the Russian Empire in the 17th century. And then, as we know, Ukraine also was part of the Soviet Union, although gradually. It was actually called the Second Soviet Republic. That's how important it was within the Soviet Union. After World War I, when the Russian Revolution begins in 1917, we also actually have this very significant moment in Ukraine's history, which is the foundation of the Ukrainian People's Republic. So this is a kind of proto-state, a precursor to the contemporary state of Ukraine today that was established in 1918, and it existed up until 1922. And that's when Ukraine starts to become integrated into the Soviet Union. So importantly, this eastern part of Ukraine, so Ukraine is divided in half by the Dnipro River. And the eastern part of the country is the part that comes into the Soviet Union first. So the Ukrainian People's Republic ends in 1922. It's basically unsustainable within the Soviet model. The Bolsheviks win the Russian Revolution and start to take over more territory. So in Ukraine, the Bolsheviks take over this eastern part of the country, and then they gradually start to move over into the western part of the country. This far western part of Ukraine does not become part of the Soviet Union until 1945. And this other key moment that's really significant in Ukraine's Soviet history is the nationwide famine that took place in 1932 to 1933. In Ukrainian, it's known as Holodomor. And this was a famine. There's instances of famine throughout the Soviet Union in these years. But in Ukraine, not only did the famine especially target this eastern and central area, it also, the political moves of Joseph Stalin, who was the Soviet leader at the time, also specifically targeted the Ukrainian intellectual class. So destroying, not allowing writers to write and artists to produce art, forcing them out of the country or killing a lot of them. And so this famine is not just seen as this moment of, destruction of Ukraine in the first place, but of the entire Ukrainian national idea. So we see a lot of parallels now. Vladimir Putin talks about Ukraine not being a country, but he is the one who is making moves to try to crush the idea of Ukraine. That's the same thing that Joseph Stalin did when he was in power and was trying to remove Ukraine, integrate it into the Soviet Union and not have an independent Ukraine. In regards to the famine that I mentioned, the scholars of this time period estimate that around 4 million Ukrainians were killed by the famine of 1932 and 1933. We don't actually know the true numbers because the Soviet Union covered up what was going on, not only at the time, so they didn't keep records of what was happening, but they also covered up information about it for many years. And so we've only just been able in the past 30 years to really understand the scope of this tragedy. And there's a lot of disagreement about the actual numbers. The highest estimates actually estimate that some 10 million people were killed in this famine. I'm talking very quickly about a very long and complex period of history, and I'm just focusing on the 20th century. And the reason for that is just simply because we see so many parallels with the claims that Ukraine is not a country, these attempts to integrate Ukraine into the Russian Empire and also into the Soviet Union, which my opinion is that was also an imperial project as well. But what's really important is that there has just been multiple efforts to make Ukraine not exist from the Russian side. And that's what Vladimir Putin is doing again today. But in reality, Ukraine is an independent country. Ukraine became independent in 1991. In this slide, you can see the referendum. This is the Independence Referendum that took place in December of 1991. Ukraine declared independence from the Soviet Union on August 24th of 1991, and then its residents voted in a referendum. And you can see here that the entire country, every single region of the country, voted in a majority to approve Ukraine's independence. Now, you can certainly see on this map that the eastern part of the country, which is historically more Russian speaking, that's partly because of its proximity to Russia and the open borders that have existed there for a long time. It's also partly because during the famine that I mentioned, when Ukrainians died or moved out of that region, Russians and Russian speakers from the Soviet Russia moved into that territory. So there was an intentional movement of people that populated the east and the center of the country with Russians and Russian speakers. But you can see that even those Russians and Russian speakers that lived in eastern Ukraine supported in a vast majority independence. And even in Crimea, which is the territory that I'll return to in talking about the original Russian invasion, even 54% of the people in the Crimean Peninsula also supported Ukraine's independence. So Ukraine has been an independent country, not just once in history. As I've mentioned, it's been independent before, but the period we're most concerned about since 1991 absolute majority of people in Ukraine supported its independence. And just a couple of figures, Ukraine's population is estimated to be about 44 million people, although Ukraine has not actually had a census since 2001. So that's an estimate. And it's around 600,000 kilometers squared, or roughly the size of the state of Texas, which makes it the largest country that is entirely geographically in Europe. So we're talking about quite a large territory. One of the things that I think is really important in this, preceding the war, it's not just the fact that Russia has been claiming that Ukraine isn't the country, but it's also this process of how Ukraine has distinguished itself from Russia since its independence. And one of the main ways that Ukraine has distinguished itself from Russia is by becoming a democracy. And, there's really no perfect democracy in the world, and Ukraine is certainly not a perfect democracy, but it has been developing in a democratic way since its independence, and especially since 2000, which that's when Vladimir Putin came to power in Russia. So you can see here that Ukraine has had 5 different presidents since the year 2000. Most recently, Volodymyr Zelensky was elected in 2019. I'm sure you recognize him from seeing, his very powerful videos and speeches. Maybe you watched him come on screen at the Grammys. Maybe you watched his absolutely heartbreaking speech to the US Congress a few weeks ago. And you also might know that he was actually a TV comedian who came to power he won about 75% of the vote in Ukraine, which was absolutely unprecedented. But all before him, there were 5 peaceful transitions of power. I can talk about 2014 being a slightly different situation than that. But Ukraine is certainly a democracy. It's becoming a stronger democracy all the time. And as you can see on the images lower down on this slide, Russia has been run by Vladimir Putin since 2000. He was briefly replaced as president by Dmitry Medvedev in 2012, I think. But Vladimir Putin served as the prime minister during Medvedev's presidency and is understood to have been calling the shots then too. And then Putin's most significant partner in crime here is Belarus's president, Alexander Lukashenko, who has been president of Belarus since 2000. So I think we can state with a lot of certainty that neither Russia nor Belarus are actually democracies, despite the fact that they have elections for presidency every few years. Those elections are known to be rigged, falsified. In a lot of cases, there's all kinds of repressions of other candidates. There's all kinds of ways that these candidates have made it so that they are the president in perpetuity, apparently. And Ukraine is not that. Ukraine has worked really hard to become a democracy, and they would like to join. They expressed a lot of interest in joining the European Union and other international institutions, long before this war began. And so I think I'm someone who agrees with the trends in analysis that say Ukrainian democracy is the biggest threat to Russia, because if Ukraine has a successful democracy, then people in Russia see that they have a different option. Ukraine's democracy has led to improved economic standards, better quality of life for people in Ukraine. Whereas Russia's authoritarian regime, it prevents them from having access to the same things and the same rights as Ukrainians. And that is very threatening to Vladimir Putin, because, he could easily lose power if Russians decided finally that they would like to live like people in Ukraine. So I would say that this has developed in a much more substantive way since the year of 2014. That's a really key year in this history. That is when Ukrainians participated in the Euromaidan protests. So these protests began in 2013, November of 2013. And basically the previous president, Viktor Yanukovych, he was supposed to sign an economic agreement with the European Union so that Ukraine's economic futures would be tied to the EU. And at the absolute last minute, he decided he wouldn't sign, and that Ukraine would go back to having a stronger economic relationship with Russia and Vladimir Putin. People were very unhappy about this. They came out into the streets. This is a photo from my fieldwork that I took in Kyiv in December of 2013. And initially, the protests were absolutely about Ukraine going to be part of Europe. But as they were prolonged and as the government responded really aggressively to these protests, they became about democracy, fighting corruption, and the future of Ukraine. And they ultimately ended with Yanukovych being ousted. He left his post. 100 protesters were killed at the hands of the riot police. And then following this change in power, the next president, Petro Poroshenko, was elected democratically, and he, took Ukraine into its European-looking future. Again, like I mentioned, this democracy has been imperfect, and even the democracy that's been formed since 2014 has been very imperfect. But the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of Ukrainians want to live in a democracy, and they want to live in an independent country. Why do I say that this precise position is most threatening to Vladimir Putin? It's because what we saw, the Russian response to the Euromaidan protests in 2014, was the first invasion of Ukraine. So after the protests ended in 2014 in February, Russian troops pretty quietly entered into the peninsula of Crimea. They took over relatively peacefully, relatively quietly. They took over this peninsula and decided to hold a referendum to ask residents if they wanted to be part of Russia. Now, what preceded the referendum was a aggressive policy of pushing out anti-Russia, pro-Ukraine voices, a repression of the indigenous Crimean Tatar population, which has long been pro-Ukraine. Most of those people were not allowed to vote, or they were already deported or pushed out of the Crimean Peninsula and were unable to vote. So the referendum that took place in March of 2014, it's not regarded as legitimate by the United States or most other powers, but something I think the official statistics indicated that 96% of the population wanted to be part of Russia. We don't really think that that's it was not a democratic referendum. So it's kind of a falsified figure, but the majority of the world sort of accepted that took place. There were some light sanctions that were placed on Russia afterward, but nothing so dramatic that would prevent them from doing something further. In retrospect, I think that's a really key moment in this entire war. But the other thing that happens in 2014 that's essential to this story is that separatist groups in the eastern regions that you see here, so these two territories are called Donetsk and Luhansk region, and separatist groups in both of these regions rose up, took over the main cities of Donetsk and Luhansk, and basically said, we would also like a referendum to become part of Russia. And initially, these were separatist groups. They were aided militarily with weapons from Russia, but eventually with Russian troops as well. And the Ukrainian forces, at the time in 2014, the Ukrainian military was not very well equipped or well organized. So a combination of Ukrainian military forces and volunteer brigades fought back against the separatists and against the Russian forces in these territories. So what's important to understand here is that these red territories of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, so it was part of the territories that were under Russian occupation as of this map is from 2015, and up until February 2022, the map looked pretty much the same. And so the gray part here was still controlled by the Ukrainian government. And so you can see distinctly on this map that the city of Mariupo was in the Ukrainian government controlled part of the territory. So this war, it continued over 8 years. It was always a hot war. There were always soldiers dying in Eastern Ukraine, but it was something that had kind of, I don't want to say stabilized, but that people on both sides had really seemed to accept. Even at the same time that war was sort of preventing Ukraine from joining NATO, from joining the EU, because countries in Europe didn't really want an active war in their institutions. And so it's also important to remember that the next part of this presentation, I'm going to talk a lot about NATO. Ukraine was not part of NATO and actually was not very interested in joining NATO at the time of this invasion. Ukraine was a neutral country when Russia invaded in 2014. And so as part of that discussion of NATO being a security threat to Russia, let's remember that when Russia first invaded, NATO was not even on the table for Ukraine. So let's talk a little bit about NATO expansion, because we also know that one of the Vladimir Putin's justifications for this war is that he has perceived NATO expansion to be a threat to Russian security. This is despite the fact that NATO is a defensive organization. It's a defensive military alliance, that the whole idea of NATO is that it will not act unless provoked. So we know that Vladimir Putin has hoped that NATO would not expand, and indeed, he has said, he said before that he doesn't want any of the former Soviet republics to join NATO, and here in yellow on the map you can see Ukraine and also the Republic of Georgia. The Baltic states here, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Lithuania, are the only former Soviet republics that are in NATO. Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. These were countries that were not actually part of the Soviet Union, but they were in the Soviet orbit. And so this loss of power, it's not exactly former Soviet countries, but it is countries that were previously strongly influenced by the Soviet Union. So preceding this war, Putin was claiming that, if only Ukraine will say it doesn't want to join NATO, we won't have to invade. That's why I reminded you that Ukraine was already neutral when Russia first invaded. But why is Ukraine so interested in joining NATO now? And the reason for that, well, we understand that that NATO had previously made this promise that it would not expand. And Ukraine was a major actor in what's called the Budapest Memorandum. So when the Soviet Union ended, the majority of the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal was on the territory of Ukraine. And the US, the United Kingdom, and Russia negotiated an agreement where Ukraine would give up its nuclear arsenal, mostly going back to Russia, in exchange for a guarantee that Russia would not violate Ukraine's sovereignty. So they would protect, they would agree that Ukraine is an independent country with its own borders. And in exchange, Ukraine would give Russia its nuclear arsenal. NATO at this time also agrees that it will not expand to incorporate former Soviet republics like Ukraine. What changes, of course, is that Russia invades Ukraine in 2014, and the countries that were party to the Budapest Memorandum did not respond to protect Ukraine's sovereignty. So what we end up seeing is that in 2014, this is data that my colleagues have collected. This is all Ukraine. This represents all of Ukraine. So what we see in 2014 is that Ukrainians become interested in joining NATO because the security structure that existed up until 2014 has been proven not to protect them. And so what we see is that we absolutely see a switch in people who they agree that Ukraine should join NATO eventually. And then we see a huge spike in 2019. This is when Zelensky gets elected, and we start to see him ramp up some of this rhetoric because Russia is ramping up its threats to Ukraine. But the other significant thing about this particular data is that it's not part of Ukraine. This is the first time, this 56% in 2021, this is the first time that it's a majority in every single region of Ukraine that a majority of people want to join NATO. And so that, again, is an indicator to Vladimir Putin that something is shifting, and that's part of what explains why he makes his move when he does. Now, I also want to mention that experts have also agreed that Ukraine was probably at least 10 years away from actually joining NATO this year, because Ukraine only started to reform its military in 2015. It has a long way to go to reach NATO standards. There's also, economic standards that have to be met, political standards that have to be met. So it's not as if Ukraine was days or months away from joining NATO, if it ever would have been accepted. It's just the fact of the possibility that has allowed Putin to create this narrative of NATO as a threat. And so I think, the reality or the likelihood of Ukraine actually joining NATO, it certainly wasn't especially likely in 2022. But now we know that NATO expansion is a lot more likely because countries like Sweden and Finland that were previously neutral countries are much more interested in joining NATO now that Russia is actually invading a sovereign country. So that's our kind of general security picture. I want to turn a little bit and talk about the actual military operation that's happening. So I've updated my maps, and what you can see, I've done a similar presentation a couple of times, and I've continually updated the map on the left. And honestly, the first version of this presentation was much redder. This invasion is not going the way that Russia had planned at all. Previously, this map was red all the way into central Ukraine, and now it's only red over here. So basically, in the past, at the beginning of April, the Ukrainian forces liberated the towns and villages around Kyiv. I am sure that you saw the absolutely horrifying images coming out of Bucha, Irpin, Borodyanka, the small towns around the city of Kyiv, Ukraine's capital. And that was when the Ukrainian forces pushed Russian forces back. And over the past few weeks, what we have seen is a regrouping of those forces with the presumed intent of them coming to make a more aggressive move in the east. So that's why what you see on this map is a lot simpler than previous maps that I've shown, because they've got fewer options. So what we're seeing now, if you look at this map at the top, this is a zoom in on this part. So what you see here is what it looks like is Russian forces moving down to try to encircle the parts of Donetsk and Luhansk that were previously under Ukrainian control. Like I showed you in that earlier map, most of those territories were still under Ukrainian control, but the Russian forces are trying to move to encircle those parts of the country. We know that they already had a large naval base in Crimea, and so that's part of why this has been, Kherson in the southern part of the country has been an important target of this aggression. Although you've probably also seen the images of the Russian warship that was sunk by Ukrainian Neptune missiles, which was an absolutely astonishing loss for the Russian military. Ukraine does not have naval capacity, and the fact that they were able to do that was just phenomenal. But what a lot of experts are agreeing on right now is the likelihood that the Russian military is reorganizing to make a claim for all of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions and this land bridge to Crimea. And part of the reason for that is because Crimea is actually got very few natural resources, especially water, and it's very difficult for them to access those resources. So previous to Russia's occupation of Crimea, the Ukrainian government was supplying the majority of Crimea's resources. And when Russia took it over, there was a huge problem of getting people water, among other things. And so taking over this territory allows Russia, as you can very clearly see on this map, it allows Russia to have access to Crimea and the southern and eastern parts of Ukraine. So we're still seeing a dividing up of a Russian claim for this territory and a dividing up of this territory, but we're not seeing this attempt like we saw in early February to clearly try to take the capital of Kyiv. And I just want to point out here, I've mentioned Mariupo a few times, and I thought this graphic was especially helpful. So Mariupo was a stronghold of the Ukrainian military and Ukrainian forces, but we've seen the Russian forces advancing, and you can just see them taking over more and more of the city. The part here in gray is Azovstal plant, which is the only thing that the Ukrainian forces now control. And they are trying to protect the hundreds of civilians who were sheltering from bombings and strikes there. They're living in the Azovstal plant, and they're unable to get people out, but they're also unable to get supplies into them. So that's kind of the kind of military situation at the moment. I'll talk a little more about the humanitarian situation, because I think that's something that, both of these are of course, very important. But the humanitarian crisis that's happening is continuing to develop and unfold. So I mentioned already This map comes from the UN Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and the information that the UN office gives is the following. We've already seen 5 million refugees from Ukraine. The majority of these people have gone west. 2.8 million people have gone to Poland. You can see here between 300 and 400,000 people have gone to Slovakia and Romania, and somewhere between 400 and 500,000 people have gone to Hungary and Moldova. And I'd just like to point out that the population of Moldova before this was only 2.6 million people. So nearly 500,000 Ukrainians is a huge influx of population for them to experience. We see that under 25,000 people have fled to Belarus. The number, according to the UN here, is about 600,000 people who have gone to Russia. Now, I don't know that this number, it's a kind of complex situation because there were certainly a large number of Ukrainians who left to go to Russia voluntarily, but we are also starting to hear stories of Russia forcibly deporting many people, hundreds of thousands of people from Ukraine. Russia is claiming some of these, but we're not sure how many they're claiming versus how many are actually there. We're starting to hear some stories of people, for instance, who were forcibly deported from Mariupo and brought to Rostov, for example. And we really, this is a number that we just don't know. Then additionally, this UN office also estimates 7.1 million internally displaced people. So most internally displaced people have left from the eastern and northern parts of Ukraine to go to the west, or these are people who left the villages and towns around Kyiv that were attacked. The problem is that we don't have a lot of information about internal displacement. So one advantage of knowing about refugees is that border crossings, we can count border crossings pretty easily. So the reason we have such clear numbers is because we've got passport control. And so we're checking where people go and when they go. We don't have the same information in Ukraine. So anybody who moves within the borders of Ukraine, there's no checking. There's no way to know for sure how many of them. And actually, I updated these numbers yesterday, and the number of internally displaced, the number of refugees to Poland had increased by about 300,000 since mid-March. The number of internally displaced had actually stayed the same since mid-March. And I don't think that's because people haven't moved. I think it's because we don't know how to count them, and we don't know exactly where they're going. And then in addition, we're referring to people who have moved within Ukraine as internally displaced. But in reality, a lot of these people have become homeless. Their homes have been destroyed. Their towns and cities are not safe to return to. Many of the roads leading to these places have been mined. We have evidence of Russian soldiers leaving grenades and mines in people's homes. So it's not just a question of internal displacement, it's a question of what do people have left? Is there a home to return to if that's ever an option? And we don't really have the answer to that question. So internal displacement is a key figure, but it's also telling us a lot about the services that people need. People are moving to places where they can more easily access safe housing, where they can more easily access food, medicine, and so people are working really hard to get that help to people within Ukraine, including the places that are under siege. Now, I've mentioned Mariupol, which has been under siege since the end of February. This was a city of nearly 500,000 people. We do not know how many people remain there. I must see a different number every single day. Today, I read an article that estimated that between 130 and 200,000 people might still be remaining in Mariupol. The local authorities have claimed that at least 22,000 civilians have been killed. Today, the news broke that there's satellite footage of a mass grave outside of Mariupol. We really don't know the toll. And one of the other issues is that every day there has been an attempt to create an evacuation corridor for civilians. And almost every day this week, that corridor has not been protected. And that's because the Russian military, the Russian forces control the way out of this city. And if they don't want to let people through, then people don't get to go through. And not just people, but supplies too. So people, I mean, people are starving to death in Mariupol. You may have seen the absolutely devastating story of a Holocaust survivor who at 91 years old died from exhaustion and starvation in Mariupol. And we're only getting some of these stories because the first thing that the Russian occupying forces did when they arrived in Mariupol was to cut the cell phone service. So it's almost impossible to get information in and out of the city as well. And this is really just a devastating single example of you know, things that we might see more of as this war unfolds. I want to leave, you know, kind of respond a little bit to that with a slightly more optimistic, you know, part of the story, which is just how people have been responding. And so in Ukraine, people who have stayed have been organizing humanitarian aid. They do what I call self-organization. And so basically, if people are in a position to help, they will help however they can. So sourcing, raising money for military aid, so helping people who are in the territorial defense units. So these are units of people who are not part of the official Ukrainian military, but the territorial defense is localized in the different cities around Ukraine. They're helping with humanitarian efforts, with evacuation. People within Ukraine are helping deliver aid to them. They're helping deliver food, essential medication to the places that are under siege. And they're helping people get out of the country. And then once the people get to the borders, we know that the Polish government has very generously lifted its requirement to have a biometric passport to get out of the country into Poland. So it's become a lot easier for Ukrainians to get into Poland. It's become easier for them. They've been allowed to take their pets, which is just something that enforces the, you know, human dignity. And then on the ground, a lot of humanitarian organizations in Poland have been responding to the needs of Ukrainians, helping them get, you know, safe places. And as we know, the majority of people who have left Ukraine are women and children, because martial law has meant that men between 18 and 60 are not allowed to leave the country because they might be called up for military duty. And I will say that the men that I know who have remained in Ukraine, who are not part of the military, are either in the territorial defense forces, or they have been working to volunteer to provide and distribute humanitarian aid. So every single person is doing anything that they can. And that's a very, you know, I don't want to use the word heartwarming because it's a horrible situation, but, you know, people are really motivated to do anything that they can. And that's really just amazing to watch. So I'll just end here. I wanted to give a couple of ideas if you're interested in helping. Further, there are a lot of opportunities that you can donate to great causes. Books Give Refuge is an initiative from some colleagues of mine to get books to Ukrainian refugee children in Poland. These are colleagues who are Ukrainian and Polish, and so they're helping you know, get kids something to read to make them feel a little bit normal. But this fund also supports Ukrainian publishers. The organization Come Back Alive supports the Ukrainian Armed Forces, and Nova Ukraine is a great humanitarian initiative as well. You can also easily contact your representatives and ask them to continue to support Ukraine with humanitarian and military aid. That's a form that you can use in this link, and I can also share these in the chat. And then honestly, reading and sharing verified sources is a really important thing that each of us can do from home. You know, this talk is an example of good information that you can share. But if you're looking for great English language coverage of everything going on in Ukraine, I highly recommend the Kyiv Independent. It is a crowd-funded online news source. Most of their journalists, if not all, are based in Ukraine. They cover the war really well. I highly recommend following that outlet as well as those journalists. They all have Twitter accounts. They're really active. And then my institute, the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard, also has collected a lot of information, different sources, put them all together. If you want to dig deeper into any of these particular topics, then those sources are available to you there. So thanks everyone for listening. I'm happy to take your questions on whatever aspect of this presentation was most interesting to you. So please feel free to submit those via the Q&A function. And while you're getting your questions in, I will I will send the links in the chat so that if you'd like to look at anything further, you are going to be able to. yes, so I will also share the presentation. I see a question in the chat. If I can send the links in an email, I will send this to the organizers of the event and they can distribute it to everybody here. There we go. So we have a couple questions. Yeah, so the question about does all of Ukraine speak Russian? Ukraine is a very bilingual country. Pretty much every person that I know in Ukraine does speak both languages. There are similar languages, they are not the same. I am someone who has learned Ukrainian. I've tried to learn both, but I only really speak Ukrainian. So they are different languages, especially in places like Kiev, in the capital. It's very common for people to still use Russian in a lot of social settings, although it's shifting more toward Ukrainian. In Western Ukraine, it's much more common to speak Ukrainian as people's first language. And in Eastern Ukraine, it's fairly common for people's first language to be Russian. But really the majority of the country is capable of speaking both languages. And there's a lot of what we like to call passive bilingualism in Ukraine. So if somebody is spoken to in a language, they'll speak. So maybe somebody speaks to me in Russian, I'll respond to them in Ukrainian, and nobody really necessarily switches because we can all assume that everybody sort of speaks both languages. So it's a very interesting and you know, kind of more akin, honestly, to a country like Finland, where most people speak Swedish and Finnish both. And it's a very widely accepted thing. There's actually a fantastic author named Andrei Korkov. He's a Ukrainian novelist he's Ukrainian, but he's comes from a Russian-speaking family. And he was born in St. Petersburg, I believe, but he's been in Ukraine for most of his life. So he writes in Russian. His books, by the way, are banned in Russia. He has advocated previously that the Russian that is spoken in Ukraine is actually a different language than the Russian that's spoken in Russia. And I always thought that was a very interesting perspective. I'll type his name in the chat. He's my favorite Ukrainian novelist. I recommend everything he's written. He's fantastic. And he'll give you just a fantastic sense of contemporary Ukraine. And many of his books have been translated into English. So there you go. There's another organization. There's a comment here that also says many people are returning to Ukraine. I think the last number that I saw of people who are returning to Ukraine, either from anywhere, this person mentioned Germany, but from a lot of places, it's something like at least 1 million Ukrainians have returned from around the world to fight, which is just, again, phenomenally interesting. Yeah, so we can address this Ukraine being an issue in our presidential elections. What was Hunter Biden doing in Ukraine? Obviously, you all remember that Ukraine became part of the impeachment trial of Donald Trump. Hunter Biden was sitting on the advisory board of a company called Burisma, which was a gas company in Ukraine. And this was actually very common that seemingly completely unqualified Western people served on the boards of these types of organizations. It was kind of I'm not sure how to put it, but just a thing that happened. Burisma is not a very transparent company. It was subject to some various anti-corruption investigations by the Ukrainian government. Was Hunter Biden doing something wrong by being there? Absolutely not. Was the money he was paid by Burisma for doing his job ill-gotten? Probably so. But that was a deeper question of Ukrainian domestic politics, and rather than, I think, some nefarious American political interest in Ukraine. Honestly, I don't want to spend too much time on exactly this topic, but Marie Yovanovitch, who was the ambassador in Ukraine during the Trump administration, her book has recently been published, and I would highly recommend reading that if you want to learn a little bit more about some of those internal workings. She's just a phenomenal woman and public servant. So let's see. Question here: how do you define an imperfect democracy? Is there a perfect democracy? I don't think there's such a thing as the perfect democracy anywhere. I think, honestly, I've talked about Finland a lot tonight. I'm very interested in Finland. Finland and Sweden, these are probably the countries that are closest. And that's because, you know, they're the happiness factor of the people who live in those countries and the level of trust in their governments is higher than most places. I think the US is absolutely an imperfect democracy. I think democracy is something that we have to fight for and have to constantly be, you know, thinking about and contributing to in any way that we can. I think it's important to note that Ukraine, you know, to call Ukraine a democracy, because it is a democracy. At the same time, it has been very flawed. I mean, one of the major things when you think about Ukraine, a lot of people think that, you know, it's just corruption and that's really the bottom line. And I think it's a lot more complicated than that. But the fact of the matter is that it was characterized by the peaceful transition of power multiple times. You know, so I think that's why I use that word, imperfect democracy. And I would also say I have been very critical of the way that in the past experts have often called Russia a hybrid democracy. That is something that I think has allowed people to justify this idea that Russia, it wasn't inevitable that Russia become this authoritarian regime that it is. People really were holding out hope for a long time that Russia would be more of a democracy. And I think that that has proven itself to be very false, but it's important to reinforce that Ukraine is a democracy, in contrast, right? In absolutely in contradiction to what's going on in Russia. So I think that's part of why, you know, I use those words. So we have some questions here about where Putin might turn his focus next, what the Russian goal is, why the genocide and total destruction of cities. I mean, Putin has made it pretty clear that he does not believe Ukraine should exist. I think that's frankly the goal. I don't see any other explanation for this response. And you know, taking Mariupol as an example, I mean, Mariupol is a city that was, as you saw, it was in the Donetsk region. It was the home to many people who had left the occupied territories since 2014, and they had moved to Mariupol to restart their lives. It was a peaceful city. It had been rebuilt after the war. Frankly, it was a very pro-Russian place, or a place that was very outside of the typical political discussion. So people were more interested there in, you know, quality of life and having a job and finding housing, right? They weren't always talking about which side they were on. And that city has been decimated. So this was never about trying to win Ukraine over, because if it had been, then Russian forces would have quietly gone into Mariupol and decided to try to convince people that they'd be better off in Russia. Instead, this war started with bombing that city into oblivion. So that indicates to me that this, I mean, first of all, you know, obviously many of the choices that Putin has made here are not good choices, and they're not based on good information. So, you know, it's hard to say what he has known at any point that's influencing his decisions. But, you know, I think that makes it pretty clear that he's not interested in Ukraine surviving at all. And that's very frightening. And so the question here of whether the academic community is as surprised as the military and intelligence organizations at the incompetence of the Russian military, I don't know. I mean, I would say probably so, just based on what we have been told. I mean, the intelligence has all been very much, you know, that Russia has the second or third strongest military in the world, and the incompetence, you know, it's not just, it's been at different levels, right? That's been what's so interesting. So we have troops who are clearly undertrained and underfed and very uninterested in fighting. We have, what I have heard is that Ukraine has actually been pretty competent at cutting off Russian communication mechanisms. So that's why so many high-ranking officials have had to go fight at the front, and that's why so many colonels, generals, lieutenant colonels have been dying. Russian military equipment is suffering, clearly, and so the level of incompetence, I think, is pretty surprising. We've also seen, by the way, the vast majority of Russians who have been killed in this war are not ethnic Slavic Russians. They're people from eastern part of Russia, from Siberia, from Dagestan. So that's something that is not that big of a surprise. That's historically been true as well, that Russia will kind of allow non-ethnic Russians to be killed first. That's happened before. I think the thing that's most surprising is, in fact, the opposite, the competence of the Ukrainian military. And that is partly because during the Obama administration, in lieu of providing lethal military aid to Ukraine, the United States and the Canadian militaries in particular helped train the reforming Ukrainian military to be able to use new technology. So for instance, drones. So they were training the Ukrainian armed forces to be, up to better standard. And that's what we have seen. We've seen their competence has been phenomenal. And so there's a lot of attention on things like the territorial defense forces and volunteer forces. But the reason for that is because the Ukrainian military is very quietly doing its job. It's not being exposed in advance and that sort of thing. So it's really, that I think is also worth recognizing as well. I think we have time for a couple of more questions. So we have a question in the chat here about John Mearsheimer's blaming the West and NATO on reneging on promises. So Mearsheimer has said more than once, he's doubled down on this. So he says, I think all the trouble in this case really started in April 2008 at the NATO summit in Bucharest, where afterward NATO issued a statement that said Ukraine and Georgia would be part of NATO. So yeah, I don't agree with Mearsheimer. And the reason is because it's Russia has consistently exaggerated its perceived threat on behalf of NATO, right? I think it's really harmful to think of this as a war between the West or NATO and Russia. Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia invaded Ukraine on purpose to destroy Ukraine. Ukraine, based on how institutions work, I mean, NATO has an open door policy. That's how it functions. Ukraine was absolutely allowed to show interest in joining NATO. And P.S., NATO never promised that Ukraine and Georgia would become part of NATO. So there was never an agreement. Ukraine doesn't even have a membership action plan in NATO. There's absolutely no guarantee of this. So I think, I think there's this false equivalence here where there's this suggestion, that Russia has something to be afraid of in regard to NATO expansion. That line supports Vladimir Putin's whole justification for this war, which again, let me reiterate, I do not think this has ever been about NATO. It has been about destroying Ukraine. So I think that's I don't like this. I don't like this perspective where Western so-called experts decide that this is some fault that the West made Russia do this. I mean, Vladimir Putin, he decides what he wants to do. And I would also just encourage everybody to make sure you're reading Ukrainian perspectives on this, because Ukrainians are saying, no, Mearsheimer is wrong, and stop telling us how to think about what's happening. There's been some really fantastically written articles by Ukrainians of all different, backgrounds, pushing back against this idea that NATO somehow caused this to happen. So I think that's really also essential to understand. So yeah, okay, we've got a few more minutes here, so we can talk a little bit about what the media is doing. Yeah, I think, this is a great question, what the US media is doing well, what it could do better. I'm happy that the US media continues to cover what's going on in Ukraine. There has been a lot of good coverage. Most places have people on the ground who are covering things. I think initial coverage was a little bit reactionary. There's a lot going on and it was kind of hard to see what the story was. But for the most part, I think we're still seeing a lot of good coverage. I think the key thing is just to make sure that US-based sources continue to share in-depth information too, and not just short sound bites. I mean, I read, Washington Post and New York Times, and both of them have a lot of in-depth coverage still that's really good, that covers things going on around Ukraine. So I think that's important. I think just making sure, that Ukrainian voices are part of the story, that Ukrainians are telling their own stories. That's also very important. I think really, honestly, just not letting coverage of Ukraine falter, making sure that people understand that this is ongoing. And even if there's some kind of peace negotiation, that the humanitarian crisis is going to continue anyway, because unfortunately, like I said before, I don't think people are going to be able to return home very soon, which is unfortunate. Yeah. Do I think that it will take the ouster of Putin to end this? I wish I thought differently, but I'm not sure. I don't see domestic opinion in Russia changing while Putin's still in power. I mean, Vladimir Putin has controlled the media sphere, the information sphere, for a long time, and he's increased his control over it over time. So I'm not really sure that there's any alternative, other than his ouster. Now, I will say, I think any kind of foreign intervention in terms of an ouster, like any kind of plot to assassinate Vladimir Putin by the hands of somebody outside of Russia, that's a bad idea. That's going to cause like a rally around the flag effect, where people say, you were against us this whole time, now we have to fight back. But some kind of domestic coup could happen. I think it's pretty unlikely, not only because anti-war, anti-Putin resistance in Russia is very low because it's very risky, but also because people who previously questioned the government and who lived outside of, believing the Putin regime, most of those people have left now because of the crackdowns. And so what's left in Russia is true believers, like people who already believed the Russian propaganda in the first place and didn't want to fight it. So I think it's in a really tough position. And I don't know another way out of this, because there's, Vladimir Putin has to feel as if he has won in order to stop, and he won't win as long as he's making claims on Ukrainian land. Ukrainians aren't going to give up their territory. So we're in a really difficult and intractable position, unfortunately. I know that's not a very optimistic note to end on, but as long as all of you in this audience continue to follow these stories and continue to share, with people in your networks and tell everybody to keep paying attention to Ukraine, that I very truly believe that the information war is a front of this war. So when you're contributing to fighting that, you are doing your part. So thanks everybody for being here. Thanks for so many great questions. Sorry we can't get to all of them.
Thank you so much. We will be, this presentation has been recorded. We will be sending out an email as soon as we can with how to access it. We will need to get it edited first, just a little bit. Nothing taken out besides just Dr. Channell-Justice and I talking logistics at the beginning. So we'll get information on how to access that within the next week. And I've also taken I've downloaded the chat, and I will send that out as well to people, just so they can have those links that were included there. So thank you so much for everybody who attended. It was a wonderful presentation, and thank you so much, Dr. Channell-Justice.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks really everybody for joining. Slava Ukraini!